can see it. Let's go ahead and get this show on the road. All right, so what is really important here is that we want to have folks participate as much as possible. So because we're in this digital space, I know we get tired of seeing our faces all the time, but we want to make sure that people are being, we can bring everyone together as best as possible in this digital space. So please turn your cameras on, but we want to be mindful of our speakers, so make sure that your microphone is off. We will show up on the live recording if you come off of the mic. Please know that this is being recorded. So if you can only catch a portion, that's okay. We will be sending over an email with the link. If you have any questions and you want to make sure that our speaker sees it, you can go ahead and message me privately that you would like to remain anonymous. Please keep up with us on social media. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can see us on all things that says Power to Fly. So a little bit about our guest here. Barbra Gago has been building, scaling, and developing teams as a senior operator at hyper-growth companies, having brought Culture Amp, Greenhouse, and Miro to market as a founding CMO. Barbra has now democratized success as the CEO. She is the founder here of Pando, creating a clear and fair progression for opportunities for all employees. Barbra, I am so sorry. I know that was a little bit sloppy, and I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about yourself and what brought you into this space.
Of course. Thanks for the intro. As Noelle mentioned, I've been building and scaling teams pretty much in B2B SaaS. I spent my career in Silicon Valley. Most recently, though, just before the pandemic, I moved to Amsterdam. So I've been here for a couple of years as I've been building Pando. I have an interesting sort of context, having brought both Culture Amp and Greenhouse to market, which are people tools that have an opinion about how to do the right kind of people practices. And Miro is more of the future of work product, visual collaboration, but we were very distributed and scaling very fast. Pando sort of comes from my own personal struggle of not having the right tools to develop talent fairly and consistently, and really being a bit more agile in our approach to how we develop people. And so we're going to talk about a little bit of Pando, but mostly kind of the foundational work that we really do to think about how do we make career progression more equitable within organizations broadly.
Thank you so much. And for all of you here that are looking to get credit for this incredible conversation, take a look here at the SHRM ID. You're going to want to make sure to use that. So take note of that, do a screenshot, and we'll go ahead and start the conversation.
Awesome.
So some of the main takeaways for today, we'll be talking about why career frameworks are vital to your DEI program success, how to create well-defined actionable career plans and competencies for all roles and improve DEIB simultaneously, and also talk about which practices to adopt when creating, communicating, and implementing career frameworks.
All right, so let's get started. Super excited about this topic. As I mentioned a minute ago, it's a real big part of why we started Pando. It's a really important topic and something that I've seen a lot of companies moving towards, and really how do we do the right thing as organizations, and how do we build the right kind of systems? And I think this conversation specifically is really important to that. So as Noelle mentioned, what we're going to talk about today is why career frameworks really matter from an equity perspective for building and maintaining diverse talent, making things more inclusive, ensuring people feel like they belong. How do we create those frameworks? What does that process look like? What are the steps of it? What are the elements? And then what are some best practices for implementing those frameworks when you're ready? So when we think about career frameworks and why they matter, I think the biggest why for me personally is really the idea that we've created all these systems and structures within organizations, but we don't I don't know that we've necessarily created them to create equal opportunities for all employees. So fair pay, for example, has been something that a lot of companies have been spending a lot of time on and trying to figure out how to make sure we ensure that fair pay for everybody at the same level. So if you're at a level 1 or level 2, making sure people get paid fairly. But are we actually making sure that people have the opportunity to move up within their career, to actually progress in the organization, and that everybody has sort of equal opportunity within the company from that perspective? To give a little bit of context about what we're talking about when we say career framework, it's basically what we're going to be talking about is the intersection of levels and like what the leveling framework looks like, competencies, which sort of create this rubric, and then what are the behaviors and the context around that, which managers can get feedback on, which peers can get feedback on, and then how are you sort of going and pathing against those. So these are all sort of the main elements. I think the core structure really comes down to the levels, the competencies, and how you leverage that tool as a way to drive growth within the organization. When we think about the why in terms of what do these things mean for the systems and structures that we're then creating within the organization, if that's early days, we've worked with companies that are less than 20 all the way up to hundreds and thousands of employees who are sort of reinventing how they think about this or enriching the way they do it. The first and foremost thing is this is essentially the foundation for how people will grow at your company. How are they going to move at your company in their career? Where do they come in? What opportunities do they have beyond that to scale in their development? It's definitely core to creating healthier and more sustainable scaling. So companies that have grown really fast without the structure of levels or core competencies or career frameworks really end up somewhere they didn't necessarily intend to. And then they have to kind of figure out how do they recalibrate and make things fair that just kind of grew organically. It really helps connect the dots as well between hiring and onboarding and how you're developing someone within their role and how you're helping them get to the next role. So really connecting the dots between what are the skills that we need within an organization, how are we understanding where we have gaps, and also are we hiring for those same skills that we're then assessing people against once they actually join the company and develop in their role. It helps to mitigate risk. I think this is related to kind of the equity and structure, but ultimately keeps you from getting into situations where you do end up with big pay gaps or skill gaps because you haven't laid the foundation for this in terms of where people come in, what level they're at, what their role is, how they grow, et cetera. And I think ultimately, this is actually McKinsey just posted research recently that now says that career development is 100% the number one reason that people are leaving. And I think more and more companies are thinking about how to do this the right way, how to communicate it to talent that they're trying to recruit, and also to retain the talent that they already have in the organization. I'm sure many of you in employee surveys have seen this bubble up as a thing that people want and aren't seeing enough of. So it really helps you recruit and retain talent. And I think we're going to talk about that more, but it also helps you build a more diverse pipeline of senior leaders and senior ICs within the organization. Benefits, just generally, I think, as I mentioned, creating structure and transparency. Like, do all employees at your company know how to grow? Do they know what's expected of them? Do they know what's the next step? How do they get there? This usually falls on managers who sometimes know and sometimes don't know. And if you're lucky, you have a good manager who proactively coaches and develops you. And people teams try to, invest in managers to make them good managers, to help them coach employees. But ultimately, especially with distributed teamwork, this becomes more and more something that needs to be accessible and on demand to employees themselves, so they understand what's expected. It really helps retain and develop that diverse talent, builds more diverse pipeline for ICs and managers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and makes career progression accessible, on demand, I think one of the biggest pieces is reducing bias in those progression decisions. So if there is a clear framework, if there is transparency around it, if everybody's aware of what the expectations are, then the way that you make decisions about who is promoted or who is progressed is a bit more objective and less biased, and people trust the system a lot more. So what are the pieces here that we're talking about, and how do we create this? I think ultimately, like, equitable career frameworks are really the core foundation. There's a lot of different systems and structures we have within organizations, but how people interact with each other, how they grow, this is really the thing that can help you optimize the value that you get from employees. So how long they stay at the company, how much value they add over time, and really unlock that growth and fuel that growth for both employees individually as well as the company more broadly. Some things to avoid or consider. So we talked about frameworks as being a combination of levels and rubrics, levels and competencies. A lot of what we see is that levels come from compensation data. So you need to do comp bands, you're hiring, maybe you're opening up a new market, maybe you're recalibrating on that. So you base your levels off of comp data. This is useful because you have the benchmarks of the data, but it's not really a strategic advantage for you to leverage comp data levels because they tend to be pretty narrow. Like maybe there's 6 levels. They also tend to be very wide. So it makes room for more discrepancy when you start putting people in levels, why certain people get paid more or less if they're in the same level. I think stacked career frameworks, and what I mean by that is you have several IC levels and then manager levels, and then the IC levels stop and you kind of have to go into management to continue to develop. This is changing. We've seen a lot of companies adopt more parallel tracks, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Having different frameworks, or like the actual structure of a framework for different teams, this obviously is a path to inequity, because if one team, is responsible for performing against 6 competencies, or they have more levels or less levels and they get promoted in a different way, then obviously this is not a fair, consistent process for the organization. Not being transparent about what level folks are at. So I think, there's a lot of things happening around pay transparency and stuff like that. I think ultimately people just want to know what the system is, what the frameworks are, how decisions are made. And it's less about like how much money they're making and more that it's fair decisions and a fair process. We see companies using titles a lot as a way to level people. So in the early days of companies, this happens especially, it happens more frequently, I would say, in terms of just hiring, like, oh, we need a senior engineer, or we need a head of this or a head of that. And then this kind of creates a sort of leveling framework organically that isn't really anchored in what you actually need or expect from people at different levels within the organizations. And then I think ultimately when you're building this and when you're thinking about this, it's really important to bring in stakeholders at various levels and roles. So this can be individual contributors, it can be managers, definitely function heads, and those that are more caring about career development or that will have more opinions about it, so that you make sure that you can kind of input that before you start building anything they won't use. So in terms of the steps, there's 5 kind of core steps that we're going to talk through. The first one is level. So we're going to deep dive into that a little bit. Rubric structure. So that's where I was saying we don't want to have different structures for different teams. This creates inequity across the company. The competencies, so tying competencies to levels and using the 2 of those things combined to really have structured feedback and contextualized feedback for how somebody is doing currently, and also how do they get to the next level and where can they grow. And then goals, planning, and sort of tracking of all of this stuff. So with levels, I think there's a few things that we see often that I guess we could call pitfalls. The first would be too few levels. I think Apple, even 100,000 plus person company, only had, I think, 6 levels of engineering. Recently, they added more senior IC levels, but like even a company that big only had a few levels that you could be in. So the problem with this is, even if somebody is making more money, let's say you go through an annual performance review and you get a good review and you get a little pay bump or whatever it is, there's still a lack of feeling that you're progressing in your career and feeling that you're making progress or getting to the next level. It's not all about money. That is a part of this and it should be linked, but like ultimately people want to feel like they're progressing. So having too few levels is usually what comes from basing it off of comp bands, but it also limits you from having greater opportunity to help people feel that they have more mobility within the organization. The second is this stacked concept. So really just, going from junior to senior, and senior is a manager, and that's the only option. This is really limiting as well, because I think especially from a diversity perspective and also equity perspective, you're basically forcing people into roles that they might not be good at. There's the Peter principle, which basically says people, get promoted to their level of incompetence. And we see this a lot in people getting promoted to managers who don't necessarily have the skills or even want to be managers, but because they've been a very strong individual contributing performer, they've gotten those roles. And we see that in sales teams, we see that in engineering, and ultimately the damage, like that, the outcome is much worse because the team below them end up doing worse as well. So this is, I would say, more of what we see pretty often in terms of how companies are structured. And again, that's really based on, these comp bands increasing, and we're going to talk about that in a minute as well. And then the last one here is really having different number of levels, structure of levels within different teams. This also causes friction. I think the bigger you are as a company, the less likely you are to have this, probably because you do already have more levels and more structure, and those are likely consistent. But we do see this even with companies that are, in the few hundreds, where they just kind of level based on title, and they have varying degrees of level. The problem, obviously, is that there's unfair expectations within those teams. People that are outside of those teams feel like this other team has more progression or more opportunity. And also there's a miscalibration of, if you're using titles and that has meaning within the organization, then people are not really feeling like it's aligned, because maybe this title in this team is actually lower level in terms of impact or scope or responsibility than it is in another team. So this is just kind of a side-by-side example of how this stacked example sort of looks and how that can compare to having a more parallel track. So on the left side, you see if I'm an engineer, or this could be marketing or sales or whatever the role is, you go up to level 6, and then at level 6, you can become a manager. But after that, it's like you either stay on the manager path or you stay at level 6, because that's the highest level that we have at the organization. So this is the biggest paradigm shift that we've seen in terms of companies really investing in creating more levels. It doesn't mean that everybody at the organization is going to get to that level. It's going to be pretty similar breakdown, I would say, to management in terms of the number of people who actually get to those super senior levels as IC. But the important thing is that they see that they have a path. They're not forced into being management. They really have more steps that they can take as an IC, which is good for you as an organization, because obviously you keep them and they can continue to have an impact. So in terms of what does a good leveling framework look like, this is also an example of creating additional levels. So the first thing is parallel tracks. I think a lot of companies talk about having parallel tracks, but then the work that we've done digging into those, we see that they have 2 tracks, but they're not actually parallel. So parallel is where you have, the roles are relatively aligned and calibrated in terms of the seniority, the level of experience, the impact that person has. It's just one side is managing people and has good people skills, and the other is the domain expert who's continuing to master skills within their domain. That could be, for example, an engineer. It could be a creative director or a designer. Any role really can go into that track. I think the other piece is having more steps. Again, I think around just after pandemic, McKinsey had published a study because of the whole Great Resignation, and adding more levels was one of their recommendations as well, because it's an easy way to help employees have more mobility. When I mentioned the Apple example, having 6 levels, even though people get paid more, like thinking about it more as assigning those levels to those pay increases, then you also have more steps that people can take. So just because you have more levels doesn't mean that like the amount of money that you're necessarily spreading out is different. It's just you're creating more narrow compensation bands, which actually is helping it be a lot more equitable, because then you don't have 2 people in level 4 where one has been there longer and therefore is, making 50 or 60K more than the other person, and you don't really have a good explanation as to why that is. So I think the other piece is every step within a leveling framework, which ultimately ties to this career framework we're referring to, does not need to have its own title. I think one of the things that we're trying to work on is move companies and employees and managers away from like being obsessed with titles and worrying about titles. I think ultimately people want to progress, they want to move forward, they want to see the impact they're having. And you don't have to have every level associated with the title change. You could have one title with 3 different levels in that same title. So they're like engineer 1, engineer 2, engineer 3, whatever it is, but they still have that progression. So I think those are kind of the main things. The last thing that we're excited about, and I think this is important again from an equity perspective, is that there should be more pay parity between individual contributor and managers when you have this parallel model. So often still we'll see that, management is going to be paid a lot more than even senior individual contributors. And I think we're still kind of a ways away broadly in the industry of doing that. But I think by doing that, and I've seen some companies have, you're signaling to employees that it's not better to be a manager, and therefore you can stay as an IC and still grow in your career and still earn more money and still continue to progress. I will be really excited when this starts happening. Okay, so still on levels, the way that this can actually work, like the way that you actually make leveling structures work in a way that helps people progress fairly and has that transparency, is that you first make it consistent for the entire company. So with the career framework, there's levels and there's competencies. So the levels is the piece that's consistent for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're in sales, if you're in marketing, if you're in customer success. If you're a level 3, this is what it means. And this is what it means for everybody. And so this is really important because the competencies is how you make the career framework specific to the role. And the levels is how you make the career framework fair for everybody at the company. So having that consistency is important. And then how do you define the level? What does that look like? Having a general overview. So here you can see an IC4 is an established performer with strong communication skills, team and functional context. And then if you jump up to IC7, it's a highly skilled performer leading strategic projects cross-functionally to drive impact. So like generally, what does it mean to be at these levels? And then what's the business impact? What are some example behaviors? Anchoring both the level as well as competencies, which we'll talk about in those example behaviors, helps calibrate how people are acting within the organization, that they're doing the same types of things, that people who are behaving in that way are the ones that are getting promoted, not the ones who are the most loud or the most, pushy about getting promoted. We also incorporate some progression guidelines. So this is helpful for managers to really understand when is the right time to bump someone up to the next level. I think having this transparent is really helpful for that manager-employee calibration conversation when an employee might think that they're, more advanced than they are. Then anchoring back into stuff, giving very clear examples really helps to create clarity for both the employee and the manager. And then I think there's like, how do you level people and how are you consistent about leveling people? Once you have this framework built, then this is just an example. When you get this after the event, we'll share the deck so you can have this as an example, but it's basically helping managers think about like, is the person junior? Are they like mid in their career? Are they senior? And then if they're junior, okay, they're developing, like what's their level of proficiency? Is it entry level? Is it developing? And then from there, is it this or that? So even down to where somebody comes into the organization is a lot more calibrated and consistent than just like feeling like they're this level because they have this many years of experience or because they came from that company. So this is a much more objective way to sort of figure out where people sit. So the next piece outside of levels is the rubric structure. So the rubric structure is basically like, what's the format at which you want to then put competencies into. So this can be done in a lot of different ways. I think what I would suggest is that if you haven't done competency-based rubrics for these career frameworks in the past, or if you don't have it yet, it's better to start simple. Even 12 competencies, as in this example, could be too many, and you might want to start with 6 or 9. But basically, how do you want to structure what this looks like for your company? Because then each team or each function might, put different competencies in. So this example here is basically saying that for the individual contributor track, we have building, executing, strengthening as kind of like themes for how we want to nestle competencies inside. And then for manager, it's supporting, executing, and strengthening. So it's a little bit different. They're probably going to have more manager skills versus executing or domain expertise skills. Here's a great opportunity to incorporate values, company values, and you can do that we're going to talk about the competency breakdown, but you can basically incorporate your values as competencies and have those be anchored in how people are performing and developing in their role. And you want to make sure that there's a consistent structure, but that it's flexible enough for different teams and different managers or different functions to adapt it to specific roles. I would say if you haven't done it yet, start with more basic, simple. For example, a company that we worked with recently just did an IC and manager. We have other companies that start with a general rubric, a technical rubric, and a manager rubric. And then you can go back and add more rubrics, more complexity, all of that kind of stuff. I need a little break. Okay, so competencies, I would say, is really where the rubber hits the road for the individual that's trying to develop in their career at your company. And the way that you structure them is what makes it fair and equitable and consistent or not. So what we see often when companies have built out rubrics is that they do have levels and they do have competencies, but typically the competencies are pretty ambiguously defined. And don't usually have example behaviors or any kind of examples. And so it's not very usable for employees or managers in a objective or unbiased way. It still leads to how people feel about how people are performing against those. So the way that we can make these more usable, more actionable, and more fair is defining the competency at a high level. So what does communication mean? Like, that's pretty straightforward. Great. Then what does it mean at level 2? What does it mean at level 5? What does it mean at level 10? And then what are some example behaviors and example tasks for each of those? So that if I'm a level 5 and I have, the 9 competencies that I need to be performing at my level, how do I need to be behaving, acting? What's the impact I have to have? I need clarity around that, and so does my manager, so that he, she, they can provide feedback to me in a meaningful way. I think the other big piece with competencies that we've found is that in engineering orgs, for example, we might see their rubric has maybe 20 competencies, and what we find is that a lot of times those are just a bunch of skills that can be nestled into competencies. So competencies at earlier levels are going to be a little bit more narrow and simple. And then as you progress in your career, in your seniority, the complexity of the competency, the depth of it, what it encompasses becomes bigger. And so this is how often we'll look at those rubrics and we'll say, okay, these 3 skills actually can become this one competency. And this is how it kind of progresses over level to level as somebody progresses in their career. And then I think the biggest piece is then, how do you put this all into action? So obviously at Pando, we can help because we have a software that does all this. But even without Pando, if all of this stuff is done and accessible, it becomes a lot more tangible and usable to employees. And our recommendation is that when people are getting feedback to each other, if that's a peer, if that's a manager, it's important for them to understand what is the expectation for that person I'm giving feedback to. So instead of just generally saying like, oh, you're great at communication. I mean, it's okay to just give someone quick feedback and say they did a great job on that meeting or that presentation. But if we're trying to help build a culture of feedback and also reduce bias in feedback, make it more meaningful, actionable, and structured, having a reference to what this person's expectation is for their level. So if Adam here is level 5 and I want to give him feedback on facilitation and training, I can look at what does that mean for him? Like, how should he be behaving? How should he be acting? So I can say like, oh, here's an opportunity you can develop even more, or you're totally killing it. Like, you're doing an amazing job. So really pulling all of those things together to contextualize how people get feedback is really the best way to help them grow in a more meaningful way at the organization. And then I think ultimately what we're seeing and what we would love, and this is what we're trying to help companies move towards, is competency-based performance and growth. So within the context of my level, my rubric, my skills or competencies that I need to develop to perform in the role that I have in the next role, maybe in a parallel role, how am I doing and how am I doing in real time? So this really helps people see and understand their progression based on mastery of competencies in their level. It's much more objective. It's much easier for managers to get feedback. It's much easier for managers to assess employees more fairly, especially when they have that clear guideline and structure. It's a lot more objective and consistent. And ultimately, moving towards that sort of structure can enable companies to get into more of a continuous model, I think, around how people are developing and growing. So this is how you can build these rubrics. And for a couple minutes, we'll just talk about getting started. And then I think we have time to answer questions. So when we're thinking about getting started, we just went through all of the steps. I think first determining the leveling approach, what we recommend and think about is based on the current size and also the growth rate. So you want something that's big enough that you can grow into. I think even if you're small, for example, at Pando, we're about 20 plus people. We have 11 levels. So I think most companies would think that was a lot, but actually it enables us to have more steps and more mobility for people. And it also is giving us time as well to grow up into that leveling framework a bit more. So size of company, growth rate is kind of step one. And also I think kind of culturally or philosophically within the organization, there's going to need to be a consensus and alignment around that. I think within the industry, I've seen a move towards focusing on level progression and companies trying to get out of titles. They do that by creating flat organizations, even though they're not actually flat usually, because people have different compensation, they have different roles, they have different number of people reporting to them, whatever it is. And I think that focusing on levels, creating more levels and level progression is a way to give everybody the opportunity to grow and not be so obsessed with their title and that kind of stuff. Defining those levels for both the individual contributor as well as manager. We've had some companies that we've worked with that wanted to have like a third role. We have had some companies that did have a third role. You can do additional roles if it makes sense for your organization, but sometimes it ends up just being that it's kind of like an in-between tester role. Like we have a IC path that we want to have sort of training wheels around for becoming a manager, and maybe they have an escape route back to IC. So usually it can either just be the parallel paths, or if you need a third one, you can do that as well. The creating the rubric structure for the org, and this is really going out and seeing what already exists. This is a lot of work that we've done as well, as kind of auditing what engineering has, what customer success has, what all the different teams have. And then you can usually see that there's a lot of overlap between certain sets of competencies so that you can then build a structure that will work for everybody at the company. Start simple, as I mentioned before, either just a few general career frameworks or maybe role-based frameworks to start. Running workshops with managers, making it collaborative is a really good way to help them get bought into how this works and how to use it and how to have structured conversations, how to develop people through competency-based feedback and performance. And then of course, this is like a lot of philosophical stuff. So first it's about being aligned around that. And then if it makes sense, there's tools that you can scale and optimize this process with. Some best practices, I mentioned that already, getting buy-in early from leadership and key stakeholders. We find that engineering orgs tend to have a lot of opinions about this. Design also, certain types of managers, sales orgs, you know, they have a lot of people doing the same role. This is why these things are so important as well, to make sure that you're, you know, promoting people within teams like that fairly, auditing what's been done. Tying this initiative and this work to key insights that you have. A lot of companies that we've worked with, for example, cite employee churn rates or survey results where employees are saying there isn't career development, or they don't feel like they have career development, or their managers aren't supporting them enough in that area. That's a great way to kind of tie the why of all this to those type of stats. Of course, diversity stats also are at play here. Be transparent with employees about the process and outcomes, and then roll out career frameworks alongside feedback and coaching training. So using this as a kind of stepstone to helping create a better feedback culture, a better coaching culture where performance is not something that's managed or done to employees, but rather something that's a collaboration between the employee and the manager. So the manager is really acting as a coach who is really trying to develop them and really trying to help them progress to the next level, rather than, saying, okay, you're bad at this, you have to go. I think that's a big shift in sort of how we're approaching all of this. Real quick on how we can help, if anybody is working on this stuff, or if you just want to talk about it, I'm free and happy to hop on a call anytime and just geek out about this stuff. I don't know. For me, it's very interesting and exciting, but we work with companies to build out leveling frameworks in our system. We have the definitions and the content and everything already defined. We work with companies on rubric design, auditing the existing stuff that's there and helping them understand what the best approach can be. And then, of course, our system is kind of connecting the dots between all of these things. So we have built-in levels, the definitions, we have library of competencies, and then the framework is really based on competency-based feedback and performance. So it's designed to be iterative, agile, and kind of like baby steps to growth. There's a lot of tools for managers as well, just in terms of having structured conversations and calibration around where do I think you are? Where do you think you are? Let's have a conversation about expectations. Doesn't matter if we're right or wrong, or if we're misaligned. It's just about continuing to get that better alignment. So I will stop there, and I guess we can open up for questions.
Absolutely. So if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat, or send me over a message directly in the chat if you prefer to be anonymous. Barbara, thank you so much for that really important understanding of what framework is and helping us with the language, and also understanding where Pando can come in to help. Some of you have already shared some great questions, so I'm going to go ahead and share some of those. But again, if you have any, make sure to go ahead and put those into the chat. So first question here for you is, how and when can we measure the success of the career framework that has been created?
So I think that's a great question. I would say there's, like, in terms of how do we measure it, I would say there's a couple of key pieces. One is, I think ultimately what this system and structure should create is more diversity in your pipeline for senior individuals at the company, as well as management. So being able to look at that and track that is one. Like, how diverse is the pipeline of people who are getting promoted and getting those jobs in either senior IC or management roles? I think it's probably not that easy to do manually, but this concept that I've been thinking a lot about is employee growth score, or like velocity. So what is the growth over time that different employees have? Like, what's the average progression pace? Is it 16 months? Is it 2 years? And then really understanding what that is, and if you can optimize it, and also using that as a metric to understand how different cohorts within the organization are comparing. So like, do men and women progress at the same pace or not, or different demographics? And then I think benchmarking with your engagement surveys, if you're doing those with some of the metrics that I mentioned before. So if you are running engagement surveys and you are seeing that your career path or trajectory or growth opportunity score is low, like, benchmark that, do this work, and then check in and see what the results are. Like, those are some kind of initial thoughts on metrics.
And that's excellent. I know anybody who works in DEI will constantly asked about what is the measure of success. So anyone who had that question, I hope that helped bring you some ease there. So another question here is, how does using career frameworks help the company finances? And how does this help with retaining employees? So retention, I think, is an easy one. If you don't
show and tell employees what their path is and what the opportunities are, you're basically telling them they don't have one. So that's a recipe for, I'm going to peace out in 6 months or 9 months or a year, because I got here, I heard all these things, but where is the action? Where is the proof? I don't see it. So doing this work, showing employees they have a path, implementing it and putting your money where your mouth is step one. That will definitely retain talent, to the point that McKinsey made in their survey or their recent study, that this is the reason people are leaving. So if you don't have this and you say you're doing career development, how do people know? Like, what are the tools that they have to actually grow in their career? So that's one. I think on the finance side, one of the things that we're really excited about building, and I think it's really tied to, like, when I was at Greenhouse as a leader, not on the people team, but I was head of marketing, and I had implemented career frameworks for my team. And then it kind of like spread out from there, and we started developing them for all of the different parts of the organization. We never had a performance review process. Like, career progression was something that happened like on a bottoms up way, organically. Like, we invested in managers, helped them understand how to grow people. And we also gave employees the tools to know how to grow themselves. And so it was always kind of this bubble up like proposal from the manager and the employee that, okay, this person's ready to progress. Here's why they've done X, Y, and Z. I think for me and my sort of vision and how I see this stuff changing in the space, I don't know that it's possible quite yet. We're working on getting companies there, but moving away from that kind of cyclical review process where there's a budget that gets divvied up and every function leader has their budget and then decides, okay, this person gets this much, that person gets this much. I think moving to a place where we're more agile will help us then forecast. Like, if we have a better, more real-time understanding of how people are performing. So, you know, I see everybody in customer success, they've been ranked against their competencies, they're this close to progression, then I can start to say, like, okay, the cost of progression will be this much in the next quarter. And then we get more into forecasting the cost of progression rather than just like setting a budget of, you know, 4% every year for this. It's much more agile also, because maybe you don't spend that much money because you're just progressing people when they progress, if that makes sense. It's not exactly it might not be answering the question exactly, but it's definitely where I hope that we get.
It's a great North Star. So a question that I just got here directly was, how do you suggest we tease out equity challenges when it comes to race, sexism, classism, behaviors, or tendency that might be an inherent part of the systems?
Well, I think starting from scratch, kind of evaluating what the systems are, I think a lot of that stuff comes from lack of systems. I mean, systems happen organically and then they kind of become solidified. But I think kind of like starting from scratch and reevaluating all of those things that we went through will inherently reduce a lot of that stuff, because those things typically come from lack of structure around all of this kind of stuff. When you're bringing people into the organization, if you're not using competencies that are consistent, or the definition of those competencies aren't consistent, or the levels aren't consistent, then you're already bringing them in with discrepancies. And then of course the systems that you have or lack, the systems that you lack potentially will just perpetuate that type of stuff. So I think like taking a step back and looking at leveling, looking at performance, like what typically happens is companies do levels based on a need to reevaluate comp bands. So they go and update their comp bands, and then they're like, okay, now we need to evaluate everybody's performance. And then you evaluate performance, but like based on what? Like what does it mean to you put somebody in a level in a bucket because that's how much compensation they have. but is that actually how they should be evaluated or where they actually are in the organization? So we're kind of oftentimes missing this stuff in between. So I think just kind of taking a step back and reevaluating each of those things, like how are we looking at levels? I think compensation is after, like build a leveling framework, have a perspective on that, map compensation there after, and then look at how are we thinking about performance, how are performance decisions made, and creating more structure is a way to reduce a lot of that issue.
Excellent. And you talked a little bit about how to get started. One question that came through was, when implementing a career framework, what roles should we start implementing with? Should we start with all roles at the same time? What kind of structure should we have there?
So I think it depends on how big you are and how complex the organization is. It's a lot of times, depending on the type of company, engineering has something, sales might have something, customer support might have something, because they have so many people already that are doing the same job. Most likely they're all different frameworks and structures, so that needs to be calibrated. So I think it's either starting with a specific team or set of teams to just kind of build the adoption around the philosophy and framework. It's having a manager rubric and an IC rubric, so doing role-based but kind of generalized competencies where maybe it's communication, collaboration, some of the values, but not specific to their function. You could start it with managers and their managers. So like keep it with managers who manage. So it's like a subset of the organization that will then be using it with the rest of the company so that they get used to it and adopt the practices around getting feedback around competencies.
Excellent. And one of the things here with putting this all into play is that just trying to communicate that out can be really challenging. So how can we communicate the framework to our employees? What would you advise us to say, or what should we not say when we're rolling this out?
I think it's like, from a communication perspective, I think it's a huge opportunity. Like, employees want to know that they have this. They'll join the company because they have it. They'll stay at the company longer because they have it. I think ultimately they'll be very excited about it. When we roll them out through organizations, we usually do kind of like, you know, the leadership team. We talk through the philosophy. We talk about what the levels are, what are competencies, what are the rubric, like explain the things that are part of this instead of just rolling out the rubric, because not everybody knows what competencies are or why or how we came to these conclusions and why we have this many levels. So we found that being very transparent about the process is helpful. It helps employees understand why things are happening and also what all of these different elements mean. I think with levels specifically, this comes up a lot where employees are wondering what their level is or how they got leveled. And so that's where I showed that kind of flow chart, like sharing those things, being transparent about those things, giving them access to the definitions and the meaning. So I think step one is communicating the work behind the rubric. How did you get there? What did you do? What were the steps? And when you do that, have it be executive leadership, managers, and then employees. And then I would say, that's kind of like, how did this get made and why are we doing it? And the second piece is, how do you use this? So from there, it's like coupling. What we found to be really successful is coupling it with coaching and feedback training so that they can get practice using it. How do you want to give feedback? Is there a specific structure that you can provide? And let them kind of test it and try it and work with managers first, but also do training with employees.
That's excellent. And I mean, employees are dying to get really good transparency. So that's wonderful. Thank you. And we're coming up to the end of our time here. I want to thank you so much for joining. Also would love for you to share any way that folks can get in contact with you and learn more about Pando.
Yeah, so, well, we'll send out the deck, I think, and there's I don't know if we'll send out the deck, but my email is there, Barbra at Pando. We also have a big event next week called Pando Horizons, which you can Google and find. And there's a lot of other great content around this topic and other topics. Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn is easy. It's probably my main social media channel.
Okay, excellent. And make sure to reach out. And oh, thank you so much for putting up that event there so that we can all get engaged with Pando's event coming up here on Horizons. I think it's going to be a great time. And thank you so much for bringing this here to Power to Fly. We're always looking to get better when it comes to all things DEI. And this is something that people have been asking for. So thank you for coming to this space. And thank you all so much for joining. We appreciate you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.